Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. I'm Justine Brown, and today we are talking about iconoclasm. In February 2018, as part of a collaboration with artist Sonia Boyce, the Manchester Art Gallery replaced one of its best-loved paintings with an official notice. Those who had come hoping to see John William Waterhouse's gorgeous Hylas and the Nymphs, which was painted in 1898, they were informed that as a response to #MeToo and in an effort to stimulate a dialogue about curatorial choices, the painting had been removed. What this stimulated was more like an outpouring of grief as the public demanded its beauty back. Never mind that the episode reveals a profound ignorance of Greek myth, since the painting actually depicts females on the point of ravishing a young man famed for his allure, rather than the reverse. It's not surprising that, given an opportunity, the art establishment would jump at the chance to annul this particular painting, since it is both figurative and classically beautiful. The art establishment frowns upon the public's taste in art, their persistent thirst for coherence, their failure to embrace the current barren ethos. Despite the fact that Duchamp's urinal is by now a stale joke, the art establishment just keeps on telling it, for it cannot seem to move past mere transgression, remaining stuck in an iconoclastic gesture. Iconoclasm, or image breaking, has a considerable history in our culture. It has become part of the Protestant rhetoric, indivisible from modernity. In modernity, iconoclastic is used approvingly, as is unorthodox. Literal iconoclasm goes back before Luther and Calvin to the early church and an 8th century controversy over the use of religious images, which erupted in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. This is known as the iconomachia, or image struggle, and it raged periodically for nearly 2 centuries. Images of Jesus Christ, Mary, the Mother of God, or various other saints were as popular in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, as they were in Rome. Multiple icons adorned Byzantine churches. Icons also stood at city gates, were taken into battle as palladia, and carried around besieged cities. For a time, icons in Byzantium were even appointed as godfathers to babies, although this practice was later discouraged. The iconoclasts declared war on these religious images, considering them blasphemous. They argued that their use amounted to idolatry, citing the Old Testament commandments against the use of graven images, which read as follows: "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God." What had prompted the iconoclasts' interpretation of the commandments? Why did the iconomachia erupt in Byzantium but not in Rome? The answer is that the destructive mobs who decried the evil art of painters rushed into churches and cathedrals to smash paintings and behead statues, frequently harming those who rushed to their defense. They had been influenced by the latest monotheistic iteration, Islam. Barely a century old, Islam was making inroads all over the Middle East, which was at that time majority Christian, an often overlooked fact in our days. Islamic warriors were beating down the walls of Christendom. Christians in the East worried that the Muslims' military success might be a sign of God's disfavor, and some suspected that the widespread use of icons were the reason. Like Christianity, Islam is an Abrahamic religion. Both draw heavily on Judaism. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, not only preached against idolatry, he was a literal iconoclast himself. One of his most famous acts was to smash the idols of the Arab polytheists as he conquered Mecca. Muhammad destroyed 630 idols in the Kaaba temple, preserving only the unadorned black stone, which Muslims believe to have served Adam and Eve as an altar in the Garden of Eden. It was created white, but is said to have grown dark with the sins of mankind. When Muslims journey to Mecca, they kiss the black stone. Strict Sunni Muslims hold that Muhammad's ban on images extends beyond the category of religion to include all representations of animated beings. In the Hadith, the accounts of Muhammad's life by his companions, we learn that the Prophet of Allah would refuse to enter a house containing a curtain or pillow decorated with animate figures. Muhammad describes those who represent human beings and animals as the worst of sinners, saying, quote, "All the painters who make pictures will be in the fires of hell," unquote. Why? The answer is that the paintings are seen as attempting to ape Allah's creative powers. These efforts amount to an ugly parody, since the gift of life is something only Allah can bestow. In hell, these artists are commanded to breathe life into their puppets. Because they never can, they may never escape hell. Figurative art, whether religious or secular, involves a kind of subcreation at two removes from God. Muslim artists have compensated remarkably, like a blind man whose other senses come alive, for this restriction by focusing instead on calligraphy and on fashioning elaborate geometrical patterns. The Islamic view of figurative art, mimesis, is somewhat reminiscent of Plato. Plato warns against the seductions of poets and takes a dim view of visual art. He argues that our world lies at one remove from reality. Ultimate reality contains the true forms of everything, while we are but shadows. Our artwork, insofar as it apes the material world, is at two removes from ultimate reality, a shadow of a shadow. In Book 10 of the Republic, we have the example of 3 beds. One bed, formed in the mind of God, is the ideal one. The second, made by the carpenter, is but a flawed copy of the first. The third bed is painted by the artist, and is a flawed copy of a flawed copy. The opposing camp, those Byzantine Christians who defended the use of images, are known as iconodules or iconolators. The iconodules were unwilling to give up a practice which had served the Church so well when Christians were a persecuted minority. Icons had provided a rallying point for the fledgling Christian community. Furthermore, icon painting was and is a form of meditative prayer. Icons also facilitated contemplation, another form of prayer. Crucially, icons were a precious teaching tool, a way of illustrating Bible narratives for the literate and illiterate alike. Finally, they offered a kind of shorthand for theological concepts. The iconodules denied the charge of idolatry. Religious images, they claimed, were strictly symbolic in nature. They drew a clear distinction between worship and veneration. The pagans who saw the image itself as divine worshipped idols. Christian veneration, on the other hand, involves remembrance of the person in question. A painting of Jesus isn't Jesus himself, but it does enhance the beholder's recollection of his life, death, and resurrection. More importantly, argued the iconodules, the fact of the Incarnation supported the use of religious images. By the Incarnation, Christians mean that God entered history in the person of Jesus Christ. The Jewish people would not speak the unseen God's true name, much less attempt to represent him. but Jesus had established a new covenant. Paul writes to the Colossians that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. God had represented himself in human form. He had suffered alongside the rest of mankind. Now that God had been incarnated, he could, and in fact should, be represented. To represent him is to affirm this key point as against certain heretics who held that Jesus was, for example, purely spiritual in nature. Therefore, an image of Jesus is shorthand for the theological concept of the Incarnation itself. The same is true of an image of Mary, Mother of God. The God-bearer asserts that God was born into creation as a human being. The iconodule's eventual triumph is celebrated in the Eastern Church during Lent as the Feast of Orthodoxy. Their insistence on the dignity of created matter is reflected in the Orthodox and Catholic liturgy. The Church does not shy away from material things, but embraces them, appealing to the various senses. The Church makes abundant use not only of images, but also architecture, music, incense, oil, water, and physical gesture in worship. Every one of these elements was called into question by Protestants in the West after Martin Luther triggered the Reformation with his 95 Theses in 1517. The iconomachia had died down in the Eastern Church, only to burst out again in the West some 700 years later. Once again, iconoclastic mobs attacked churches and cathedrals, smashing stained glass windows, beheading statues, and slashing and otherwise removing paintings from the public eye. Now iconoclasm was inextricable from politics. In England, for example, Henry VIII appointed himself head of the English Church for political reasons. An otherwise devout Catholic, he participated in the Reformation because it offered him two political opportunities. He broke with Rome in order to give himself an annulment from Catherine of Aragon and marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn, in the hope of begetting a male heir. Later, he seized the opportunity to dissolve the monasteries and help himself to their wealth. The Puritans were actual Protestants. They maintained that Henry and later Elizabeth I had never gone far enough in reforming the Church. These two monarchs had tried to achieve an aesthetic balance between Catholicism and Protestantism. Puritans, for their part, wished to cleanse the Church of what they saw as vestigial Catholicism, whatever form it took. Religious preferences were linked to specific political positions in the run-up to the English Civil War, 1642 to 51, so an attack on religious art was also an attack on the royalist position. When the Puritan enemies of Charles I raided his wife's private apartments, for example, they destroyed a Rubens masterpiece depicting the crucifixion. After the Puritan side had won the Civil War, they erased what they saw as indecent and corrupt art forms. Not content with iconoclasm and a purified Anglican Church, they also suppressed traditional festivals, including Christmas, shut the taverns, and closed down the theaters, which had flourished when Shakespeare and Ben Jonson lived. It was a thorough assault on popular pleasures. It was in the 17th century, then, that iconoclasm became a weapon of modernity, a stage in the destruction and eventual replacement of a culture. Iconoclasts, both literal and metaphorical, were now the shock troops of progress with a capital P, scions of the Whig theory of history. Fortunately, the public sometimes pushes back against this narrative of inevitable progress. When Hylas was abducted, not by nymphs, but by curators, to make space for some piece of feminist political correctness, the public resisted. After a week of protest, the Neo-Puritans at the Manchester Art Gallery backed down and returned Hylas unharmed. It was a welcome reprieve. Still, we should ask ourselves this: why are the iconoclasts in charge of the cathedral? Thank you for listening. Please like if you enjoyed this, share and subscribe to my channel, and I welcome your comments below.